Fab. So I'll hand it over to Kate and David for this part of the session. Thank you both.
Marvellous. At this point, you can move me a little bit to the side, can you? It's very disconcerting to see me sort of glaring back at me. Thank you. Just to start off with, so welcome everybody. As I say, Kate and I from the Midland Survivorship Research Group. Kate also has another role within the Wessex Cancer Alliance. And if we can move on to the next slide, Steph, thank you. Just to say that the aims of today, well, first of all, start with a bit of housekeeping. I think, Steph, you're going to have a little look on the chat box if there are any sort of questions directly from the content of what we're presenting first. But there will be time at the end of the hour to actually have some more in-depth group discussion. So there will be chance for some broader discussion later, but any sort of urgent queries, and do feel free to put them in the chat box. The aims of the session today, well, it's the mission for Kate and I to really take the fear out of those words logic and theory and actually say about, just how helpful the concept of logic models are and the theory of change concept is, not just for the delivery of health research and evaluations, but actually in all forms of project delivery, whether it's quality improvement, service change and delivery. The concept of logic model and theory of change is really helpful for all those activities. And we're just going to do a bit of myth busting for about the first 20 minutes and then present a logic model template, which will then have some breakout group work. So those who are involved in research projects can do it for their research projects. Those who are currently or plan to change practice or look at their own sort of quality improvement work can use it for those purposes, and then we'll discuss our experiences from that. But that's enough of an intro from me, and over to the lovely Kate.
Thanks, David. So Steph, if we could go to the next slide. So I've got the lovely job of talking to you about the use of theory in service change. Probably just helpful to tell you about my background. So I'm an NHS manager by background who then retrained as a nurse. So I've done service change in various guises for the past 20 years, and then most recently completed a PhD in which I used mid-range theory. So next slide, please, Steph. So what is theory? So we tend to be put off by the word theory, which can discourage us from using it in our work, whether that's research or whether that's service change. So theory can be seen as abstract, intimidating, with little relevance to daily life, particularly when, like so many of us, your immediate concern is the work of providing care to patients on the front line. Essentially, though, theory is a really practical tool. So it's an explanation of the way things work. And in reality, we either consciously or subconsciously use theory, reason giving, all the time, using our own knowledge and experience to explain and understand why things happen. Next slide, please, Steph. So I like to break theory down into different types, and I'm not going to talk about these types in too much detail, but I just think it's useful to make some distinctions. So I'm going to talk about grand theory, middle range theory and small theory, and we're going to focus on small theory today. You'll probably be relieved to hear. So grand theory is by its very nature grand, so it attempts to provide systematic ways of explaining all of society's behavioural and structural uniformities. It tends to be abstract and to offer a theoretical lens through which society can be viewed and interpreted. Middle range theory, which I like, I call it Goldilocks theory, it's just right, and that it tends to characterise discrete conceptual ranges, offering explanations and predictions of specific phenomena. So middle range theories or mid-range theories are abstract enough to allow application across different social and organisational contexts. For example, normalisation process theory, which my PhD supervisor Carl May developed. This seeks to understand how service change is embedded into a culture of routine practice. And this was developed in healthcare initially, but has been applied to a range of contexts, most recently in evaluating the psychosocial responses to the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing. And I think middle range theories can be really useful tools for people like us who are looking at service change as frameworks for understanding problems. For example, the middle range theory of the diffusion of innovations, which I'm sure Steph and her team would be interested in, is commonly used by those undertaking service change when they, for example, make innovations consistent with existing systems, recruit opinion leaders, and use existing social and professional networks. And small theories, which we are concentrating on today, are practical and accessible and are specific to a service change. Next slide, please, Steph. So what is theory of change? Well, it's an explanation of not just whether a service change works, because we know commonly with enthusiastic groups of people, service changes do tend to work, but how and why, and also when and where a service change might work, so that the service change can be potentially transferable to other settings. And a theory of change, in my opinion, really does two key things. First, it describes in detail the components of the service change that are intended to address the problem. So what are you going to do? What do you expect to achieve? And how are you going to show that you have achieved it? And this is generally in the shape of a logic model. And David's going to talk about those in more detail. So I won't talk about those at this stage. Second, in my opinion, it helps you understand and describe in detail the rationale and assumptions that link your service change processes and inputs to outcomes, both intended and unintended. And it also helps you to describe the context necessary for the service change to be effective. Next slide, please, Steph. So why is having a theory of change important? So I think a good theory of change is flexible, and what it does is it provides an explicit shared narrative through which your change can be explained. So it facilitates interpretation of findings both within your own service change, but also gives you the potential to transfer it to other settings. It helps you incorporate learning from other settings and to share your learning with others. And it clarifies what will be achieved and how. And it's a really good project management tool. So it helps you check milestones and it helps you keep the service change on course. And it does some of the later work for you because it tends to be iterative. So you tend to repeat your theory of change a number of times throughout your service project. It helps you reflect on where you've come from and how things have changed. It does some of the later work for you. And if you're interested in publication, journals love it. So it can be quite difficult to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, quality improvement, but editors love it if you've used a theory of change. So if that's important to you, that's important. So next slide, please. So I'm being very cynical here, and do forgive me, I've worked in the NHS for too long, I think. So what tends to happen in healthcare is that some bright young thing in government comes up with a politically fashionable idea. There's little clarity around the processes that are being targeted and little attempt to expose the change to systematic challenge or understand how and why it works. The change often works well in areas with enthusiastic staff, but falls apart when people leave. People tend to focus on what works about the change, but make little attempt to understand what didn't work, the unanticipated challenges, or the toxic effects. And really importantly, as David and I have discovered fairly recently, again, in our searches on how the patient activation measure is used, that often change is so poorly described, it is impossible to reproduce. And I think the failure to provide good quality description of what the service change involved, so what were the activities undertaken and the theory of change behind behind it. So what mechanisms were at work supporting the service change to achieve its effects is really, really important. And I've placed a warning on the next slide. So if we could move to that, Steph. I'm not going to read this because you can read it yourself, but really it just exemplifies that when service change is implemented without proper understanding of what it involves and how it works, we risk reproducing only the superficial appearance of the change, but not the set of mechanisms that produce the desired outcomes of the service change in the first place. So to use a healthcare example, in Michigan in the United States, they implemented a checklist in over 100 intensive care units across Michigan. And that really successfully reduced the reduced the amount of central venous catheter infections across Michigan. But when they tried to roll out the checklist to other states in America, it didn't work. And what they'd fundamentally misunderstood is that it wasn't simply the checklist, but it was a more complex process behind the checklist that made that checklist work. Next slide, please, Steph. So my final slide, you'll be relieved to hear, is how do we develop a theory of change? So if you remember one thing from my presentation, it's important that it is this. So the process of developing a theory of change is as important as the product itself. So that iterative process, that talking through with stakeholders and ensuring that your mental models are shared, are as important as the theory of change or logic model itself. What you can do is backcasting. So start backwards, so you work backwards from the desired outcomes to determine the project feasibility. Or you can use the 5 whys, and I've put a link to that, but I like to call them the toddler whys. So constantly asking why, peeling back layers in the problem to get to the root cause. And finally, in developing a theory of change, it's important to develop and use logic models in a group. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to David to talk about those in a bit more detail.
Unmute myself first. Thank you so much, Steph. You're doing such a grand job. Oh no, I was going to say you can carry on, but you're giving it over to me. No, that's fine. Do you want to carry on sharing, Steph? Actually, have you got your slides open on that one?
I can do. I just can't do the breakout rooms with my.
Oh, fine. In that case, then bear with me one second. Can I suggest, whilst I start sharing a screen, if there are any sort of questions about the theory for Kate, whilst I move over, put them in the chat box. If not, bear with me whilst
I've terrified you all.
Okay, so whilst that my slides are uploading, so I can begin talking through the purpose of my slide. For some reason it's not opening. Hang on, bear with me one second.
Don't you just love technology?
Do you want me to keep opening mine for now?
It should go straight through. So I'll just talk to my first slide. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about, here we go, the use of the logic model, and just as Kate has done, is sort of showing about how this can be a really helpful practical tool for quality improvement work, for managing change in practice, and for research and evaluation. So just give about what a logic model is. So a logic model basically allows you to tell the story of your project, your intervention, your change in a simple and usable diagram. And it's a very helpful discipline because it does all the little bits that Kate said are often gets missed off, which are the details about what you're actually doing and the change that you're seeking to actually deliver. And it does this in a very handy, short format. So it can be printed out on one side of A4. And if you're trying to convince your peers and superiors in an organization, you can give them a one-page and say, look, this is what I'm trying to do. And it's a very helpful, snappy narrative tool that you could use. And this is why I stuck a picture of Sherlock Holmes here, not just because I had the fortune of meeting Jeremy Brett at the Wyndham's Theatre once in London, but and a bit of a hero, but also Sherlock Holmes is a classic example about demonstrating the causal connection between events. So what a logic model does is it really details the causal connection between the initial need and the desired outcome. And also related to that, it shows the mechanisms through which that change can be achieved, the details that often get missed off, as Kate said. And as I'll show later on, it maximizes the true value of the investment because it allows whatever it is you're working on to be replicated or reproduced in other formats because you're providing that detail. And also, as I'll quickly show you, if you're thinking about evaluating your service change or research project or whatever it is that you're introducing, it provides a very nifty way of determining your evaluation questions. And lastly, because it looks at the assumptions associated with the delivery of your project, it's very helpful for identifying and managing risks. So as I say, logic models are not a scary thing because we do it all the time. I reckon we probably do tens, if not hundreds, of logic models every day we live our life, because when we face with life, we're often faced in a situation where we have a specific need and a desired outcome. So I think, like many, I just noticed, for example, speaking egotistically for myself at the moment, the start of lockdown, I was putting on weight because lack of exercise, not going out and just, comfort eating, all that sort of stuff, and there was a need to actually fix that because of the long-term health implications. So that's where I wanted to go to. But of course, we all know we can't just go from A to B simply, and it happens. We have to understand what the mechanisms are that link the two, whether that is an increase of exercise, home cooking, reducing takeouts, increasing healthy food, or decreasing alcohol consumption, or all of those. And so when we identify a need and a desired outcome, we cognitively go through a process of thinking through, well, what are the mechanisms that I need to actually put in place to get to that desired outcome? And a logic model is really a systematic way of documenting that. So we talk about logic and theory, but actually, as Kate said at the start, these are not academic theories or logic. This is practical theory and logic, this type of stuff we do on a day-to-day basis in our home life and clinical practice. Now, they're two very common models, and it's quite nifty to look at this because when you actually sort of look at these diagrams, you see how often they're replicated in different guises. The first one was developed by Jane Weaver, and it's a simple triangle where you have a sort of high level aim, the sort of lower level outcomes that are related to that aim, and specifying what the activities are, what is that you're going to be doing to try and reach that high aim. And once you look at that, you see it everywhere. So, for example, this is Macmillan Cancer Support's Research Impact Framework, and they've created a logic model. And it looks very different, but it is a Weaver logic model. So we've got here, we've got aim, object, outcomes and activities. Here you've got a high level goal, which is that improving treatment and care and empowering individuals, people with cancer, through delivery of these outcomes. And the activity is the commissioning of research to deliver the evidence to inform those outcomes. Now, critique of this model is often it's simplistic. There are no assumptions behind here. There's no identification of risks or indeed inputs. And also because there are just three levels of developing a logic model, often they can get unwieldy in terms of how much information are contained in each of those sections. So another approach is the Wisconsin model, and this is more frequently used, and it's one we're going to be looking at later on today. So this one breaks down, if you're doing a quality improvement or a service change, it starts off, here's the context and need. Have you really explored what the factors are associated with the need for change? So again, this is the overweight person at the start of lockdown in this particular part. And then you jump to the impact section. Well, this is how I sort of manage logic models, and say, well, what is the desired outcome to fix that need? Have you thought through about defining what it is you want the project to achieve? And then, as Kate said, you know, often this gets missed out. Have you really detailed all the sequence of activities that link A to B? So have you thoroughly explored the resources you have to hand, whether it's staff, time, money, technology, buildings? Have you done a rich description of the intervention? Have you described it in the full detail? And then comes the outputs and outcomes. So the outputs are the physical materials that come from your activity. So it could be what's associated with intellectual property. Are you developing a tool, a system, software, an information resource, a recognized model of working? And from that, what are the outcomes? So what is it that the changes you want for the participants in your activity in terms of behaviors, practices, or whatever? So it's a separating out of the, if you like, the materials that's going to be produced from your work to the actual outcomes you're hoping that your change will deliver. And sometimes it's presented in this tabular format. Very often it's presented in a flow diagram, as in here, you know, with a series of boxes with linked assumptions and external factors built into it. Now, I show this slide partly to scare you, because it is very busy and shows you that logic models can be very complicated if not managed succinctly. And there's nothing wrong with this model. This is a project looking at reducing HIV infections, and they had a rich description of the context and interventions, but it is a little bit busy and a little bit sort of over detailed. There are other ways of presenting it. So this one is a more of a flow diagram between the situation, the actual specific need, going through the inputs and outputs. So you can actually present it as more as sort of a flow diagram. And before we move on to the practical session, I want to sort of touch on about why these things matter. And back in 2009, Ian Chalmers and Paul Glasgow published a very influential paper in The Lancet, where they suggested that 85% of global health research fund is wasted because of the failures in each of these 4 stages in the process. And interestingly, they reported that over 30% of trial interventions are not sufficiently described. That is to say, if you're doing any project, whether it is a quality improvement study, you're changing practice, you really stop it being influential if you don't give a full description of what it is that you did, because how can anybody else understand or replicate it? And the fact that so many studies do not fully describe the intervention means that it really undermines the amount of investment of time and money that goes into these activities. And the last thing I want to say before moving on, as I mentioned earlier about how separating out these activities in these 6 areas can relate to an evaluation design. Because if you think about it, the gap between context and impact is your evaluation framework. So through the resources and activities, you're identifying the process evaluation, detailing what it is that you actually did and how you came to actually make that change. And through the outputs, outcomes, and high-level impact, you're beginning to define what the outcome measures are going to be, particularly the 5th column. If you're seeking to make a change, always ask the question, how can that change be measured? And asking that question will then inform your outcome evaluation design. So it's a very nifty way, at which point I'm going to stop sharing and pass back to the group. We have got a template which I think we can either sort of share screen or we can actually share it. But really back over to Steph. Read any questions about that. I should say that the slides are, if they haven't been already, they will be shared and they have all the links in there, so you can follow up the links and do more reading yourself. But really back to the room. You're on mute, Steph.
Sorry. Thank you, David and Kate. So we have got some time now, and what we were hoping to do is to split you up into some smaller groups and to go into some breakout rooms, so that you can start thinking about a logic model for your innovation project. And Kate and David have kindly said that they will divide and conquer and one go into each of those groups. So I'll send around the documents now to everyone's email, so you should each get a personal copy, and then I'll move you through to the rooms so you can start having some discussions. They've tried to group you where your projects may have a similar a theme as well, just so you can start to get some of the other teams. Has anyone got any questions before I make the move?
Steph, can I just say something? I think there's quite a lot of information, and we could spend hours talking about this topic, so it might feel a bit overwhelming, but the reason we've designed this sort of practical exercise is to start thinking through some of the principles in practice. So it's not supposed to be put you on the spot, and we're not expecting you to come up with a perfect logic model by the end of it, but just to start thinking through some of the principles. Apart from Maria Noblett, who I am expecting to come up with the perfect logic model, because we've done one already.
I know. Well, I shall remain quiet on that one. It's just I know I've seen one, and I kept thinking, oh gosh, I've kind of been involved in one of these, but I'm not sure. Okay, you've really put me on the spot.
Sorry.
No.
Sorry, that was really.
But it's to say, truly. I mean, often it's said, but in this case, it really is important to underscore that there is no right or wrong way, because it's your project. There isn't a sort of model out there of how to present a logic model. It is a story of your own project. So you own your project, you own the logic model, and so you write it in a way that's helpful for you. So in a sense, it's just put down in those boxes what you're actually doing or planning to do is the right way.
Yeah.
There isn't a sort of gold standard out there of a right way of doing it. It's just what fits your purpose. And when you start just having a go and throwing in those columns what it is, but it actually makes you think of the key questions, and in a very sort of succinct way. And I think the idea of it, particularly for the innovation bids, is at the end of it, you've got something you can show very quickly. So if you've got, they call it elevator pitch to your CEO, there you are. What can you sort of show him or her in the lift? And this is something which is a very neat way of telling the story of what you're doing.
The paperwork's just been sent round to everyone, and if everyone's happy at this point, I'll open the breakout rooms for 20 minutes. I will give you a bit of a countdown as well, and then we'll come back into the main room.